Hey everyone, I'm going to take a look today at a book that kind of melted my brain a little bit. That is Remi Brague's The Kingdom of Man, The Genesis and Failure of the Modern Project. Remi Brague is maybe not a household name. He wasn't for me before I read this, but he is a French philosopher. I think all of his work has been translated to English at this point. This is the first by him that I've read. And so I'll take you through, as best I can at least, I'll take you through the main idea, the research, the readability, and whether or not it was convincing before I talk about a couple other books that are related to it. And I'll start at the outset here by saying that I'm really glad I read this. It is a pretty intense, not very long, but pretty intense work of kind of historical philosophy. And that seems to be his kind of his area, is that he tracks the history of ideas. So technically, this is the third in a trilogy, though it's not like obviously a fiction trilogy that you have to read them in order. It's just that this trilogy of work starts in antiquity. That's the first book. The second book is kind of about the Abrahamic religions, the monotheistic religions, and then the third book, this one here, is about modernity. So terms like modernity, postmodernity, that they kind of get tossed around a lot in certain circles, and sometimes, frankly, people throw them around and don't really, I think, don't really know what they're actually talking about. It can kind of be a way to pass yourself off as intellectual by using like modernity, especially when you accent it that way, right? Post-modernity. But Remi Brague here is essentially taking a look at the emergence of modernity in the history of ideas. And it's a giant task to do, especially in, I mean, it's not that much more than like 200 pages, which is, it's a pretty compact argument. But he's essentially trying to dig up, and a lot of people have been doing this, but he has a kind of unique way of getting at it. He's trying to dig up what are the most profound philosophical turns and shifts that both precipitated but were also furthered by the modern period. So, roughly speaking, the modern period is correlated with the Enlightenment, the Protestant Reformation, um, the advance of the printing press, kind of that whole era of the birth of modern science as we know it. That whole era gave birth to what we are looking back on as modernity. And so he's taking a look at that, but he's going so much deeper, and he's really tracking philosophical ideas quite literally from antiquity, from the ancient Greeks, for example. And this is kind of a what's known as a diachronic study. So he takes themes each chapter, which the chapters are remarkably short. He takes themes and he kind of traces like this is where this idea shows up in ancient Greek philosophy. Here's how it tracks through some medieval scholastics, and here's where it was recovered by modern philosophers, for example. And then in the next chapter, we'll kind of go through a different theme and then go back and trace another one through the timeline. So it's kind of cyclical in that sense, where he goes back and traces ideas, pulls them out, he's basically making an argument of like, here are where the seeds of modernity as a philosophical kind of movement, here's where the seeds of those were, and then here's how they kind of grew and flowered, so to speak, in the modern time period. So I'm speaking really vaguely, but he gets into pretty specific ideas. So he talks a lot, and man, this is going to be impossible to summarize in a couple minutes. I'll do my best to get at a couple things, but for example, he summarizes ideas about nature. So he compares the idea about how the ancients looked out at the cosmos and saw a place of order, and then how moderns, where we find ourselves, we look at nature and we see a place that needs to be ordered. So rather than seeing it as a place of order, we see it as something that we need to actually order. And then similarly connected to that, he talks about the idea of being human. So humans at one point would look to the skies, look around them, and take their meaning as being someone found in that place. Now we take our meaning as being people who need to master the place that we're in. We need to improve the place that we're in. It's a place that needs our conquest. Connected to that, ideas about how did we as humans come to the idea that we had what it takes to dominate and to master nature, as opposed to looking to nature for meaning for who we are and defining humanity. I mean, this is big, big philosophical stuff, which is why it melted my brain a little bit. The fact, especially, he's able to do it in such a small space. So he gets at even getting at the idea of like, how did we get to the point where we considered experimental instrumental reason as the way to learn? that didn't just kind of plop out of nowhere, and nor was it something that we thought of for all of history was a legitimate way to knowledge. Where did that come from? Um, where did the idea of us being humans, for a long time humans believed that they were given kind of the task to take care of creation from the gods or God or some divine source, whereas we've turned it into a project that comes out of our own kind of wills. So anyways, I am like barely scratching the surface here, but that's the main idea is that he's getting at, well, the subtitle, where did the modern project come from? Where did those ideas come from? What's the history of them? Who talked about this stuff? And how is it different from how the ancients conceived of the world and conceived of humanity? So it's a giant task that he's getting at with this book. And his, he his conclusion, to kind of tip the hand to the conclusion, is that modern project has actually produced, he calls it a wasteland. He points at some of the ways this really profoundly humanistic conception of ourselves and of our role as the dominators of nature, how that has actually just borne a lot of toxic fruit, and a lot of the toxic outcomes that we're now seeing, he would argue, we're seeing in our culture, particularly, especially in the West, which is the most influenced by kind of this philosophical turn. So that's, hopefully that's somewhat of a coherent encapsulation of his main idea in this book. It's a, like I said, it's a giant argument that he's making, and that gets me into the research. I'm just going to say the research is off the charts amazing. This is the highest kind of mark, I don't know, I'm going to give it in this review. It is incredible to me how much this guy has read, how much he understands, and how he can synthesize connections from literally ancient philosophers to today, to people like Francis Bacon. I mean, he draws these seamless connections from different lines of thought, and it just is astounding to me how much he has mastered the literature. I mean, he has read, I think, I made a joke to someone that I think he's read everything in every library in the world. I mean, the bibliography is like half the length of the book, the written book itself. It's incredible. So if you're looking for a resource, if nothing else, for like summarizing and synthesizing lots and lots of ancient philosophies and all the way through to modern philosophies, I mean, this is your guy. He is incredible, like unparalleled, at least from my reading experience. I've never read anything from the research angle that gets at it in the same way that he does. So it's that is just sheer incredibly astounding to me. Readability. This is not going to be as gushing. It's incredibly short for what he's accomplishing. The chapters especially tend to be very short, so it's readable in a sense in that way. But honestly, the style, I would hesitate to recommend this to everyone, particularly if you are kind of coming into it cold and you're not familiar with even like just the basic contours of thought of, yeah, like if you don't know what modernity and postmodernity mean, don't start here. Go somewhere else that's a little more readable and then get into Brague's work, because it is extremely dense. I don't know how much of that is a virtue of the translation, the fact that he didn't originally write this in English. That might be part of it. I'm not really sure. But regardless, it's dense. It's very dense writing, and even though the chapters are short, you kind of have to really chew through them before you can start to grasp what he's getting at, because again, the arguments are so deep that he's pulling out. So it's not a breezy read. It's short. It's on the shorter end for what he's trying to do, but it's not necessarily an easy read, is what I would say. And then, is it convincing? I mean, the short answer to this is yes. I mean, I'm coming at this as someone, as a Christian, as a theist, as someone who I'm very sympathetic with a lot of postmodern thinking, and I'm super critical of modernist thinking. That's kind of what I was coming into this book with already. So I was kind of, in a sense, already primed to agree with his conclusion, at least, that rigorous, consistent humanism as a doctrine, I think, is actually kind of fruitless and actually is destructive. Humanism I'm meaning that in the very specific kind of philosophical sense, kind of a materialist, exclusive humanism. I was already coming into that with that perspective, and that's essentially where he lands, is that the modern Enlightenment project, as a project based in really, really significantly secularized humanistic thinking, that actually produces a wasteland. It does not produce the kingdom that we're looking for. And so I personally agree with him. I'll say that your track with that will maybe be different depending on your philosophical predispositions or where you're what kind of line of thinking you're entering this from. I will say, regardless of where you land on that, he makes a very compelling historic case. So in terms of his summary of historic lines of thinking and where certain thinking comes from and how certain thinkers resonate with others or don't, or make really significant changes, his summary of Francis Bacon is very, very compelling to me, and how people like Bacon really made a significant turn in producing what we know as modern science. So I think regardless of whether you stay committed to an atheistic humanism or if you're coming into this agnostic on some of those questions, wherever you come out on that, I think that you've got a hard case to say that he is wrong about the threads he's tracing through the history of philosophy. That to me, he's making a very, very well argued, well researched, as I said, case that something really changed around modernity. So those are some of my thoughts on the book. This book as it stands. Hopefully you get a sense of that from whether or not this might be a good book for you to tackle. If you're philosophically oriented, if you've already kind of swam in some of those waters, so to speak, this might be really great for you, particularly if you haven't heard of him, like I hadn't before. But let me point to a couple other books, and I'll wrap up on these. If you're looking for something that's similar but much more readable, even enjoyable to read, this is a pretty well-known book right now that's getting a lot of press, I would say. Tom Holland's Dominion. This is the UK version, so it has a different subtitle than what you'd see if you looked it up on Amazon. The subtitle in the US version is something like How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. I just liked the UK version better, so I tracked it down. But this is... Tom Holland's a secular historian. He would not profess any sort of Christianity or Christian faith himself, but he's making the case in this book that our modern values are profoundly Christian, and he would say that Christianity so thoroughly remade the modern world that we're basically all Christians, even if you would call yourself an atheist or secular. We're all Christians in the sense that we value the dignity of every individual. We believe in listening to, at least theoretically, we believe in listening to the marginalized and pursuing equality and justice, regardless of one's tribe, ethnicity, nation, whatever. That's a profoundly Christian idea that he argues has kind of remade the world. And so he's similar in the sense that he tracks the history of ideas. But this book, Dominion, is extremely fun to read, I would say. It reads very differently from Brague's work. It's very, very enjoyable and also a great synthesis of ideas over history. So that might be a good starting place for you if you don't want to go quite into as deep the philosophical work that Brague does here. On the other hand, if you want to go even deeper on the philosophical side, to maybe even a harder book to read, Taylor's The Secular Age. I mean, Charles Taylor is one of the eminent. I mean, this is a monster of a book. It's about 900 pages of philosophy, and he's one of the he's a Canadian philosopher, one of the preeminent philosophers on secularism and secular thinking. Kind of like Brague, he traces the history of ideas. This book, however, is more limited to the Reformation to today. It's kind of that period, whereas Brague reaches much deeper into the ancient philosophy. But A Secular Age is, if you're familiar with this kind of stuff, you've probably already heard of A Secular Age if you haven't read it yet. But if you want to go even to the kind of next level deeper, then this is one I would recommend for sure. Hard to read, not the easiest thing to read. Taylor, I might read a review another shorter Taylor book here soon on the channel, but Taylor's writing style is very circular, kind of repetitive. He's unpacking ideas and revisits ideas, so his style is not the easiest to get into, but in terms of just philosophical rich content, I mean, he is the master. I think he's one of the best. So those are kind of on the readability ends. That's kind of on two different ends of the spectrum. And then I want to highlight just one more. I want to highlight one Christian thinker that I've been super influenced by. I'm going to kind of do a twofer here and talk about two of his books. But Lesslie Newbigin is one of my favorite thinkers on secularism, culture, diagnosing what's happened, like philosophical changes, and he's super readable. Both these books are short. He's got a bunch of others that I'd recommend too, but these are the two that I usually start with. Proper Confidence. He talks about the role of faith and doubt, and certainty and nihilism. He's got very short chapters on each of these concepts, and he's writing to the modern person. particularly for the believer. So if you're a Christian that's interested in these kinds of things, this is a great book. What does faith mean? How does doubt factor into my ideas about the world? Does doubt have a role to play? Should I be chasing certainty? No, you shouldn't. But he's going to argue that brilliantly. So proper confidence, and then honest religion for secular man. This is a little bit of a underknown book by Newbigin, but I think it's brilliant, particularly in the way that he diagnoses what change secularism has wrought in our culture and how should a Christian think about it. And actually, he has a very hopeful, optimistic. What I like about him is he's not a culture war kind of mentality. He's not like decrying secularism as this big bad evil thing we have to fight against, but he's actually incorporating the secular turn into how do we understand it in terms of God's role in the world, and how might secularism actually be a unifying thing in the globe, and how do we respond to it with optimism and hope and love as a Christian, as opposed to warring against it. So I love this book. I love all of Newbigin's work, but those two in particular are good starting points. If this kind of philosophical wrestling is of interest to you, in particular if you're a Christian, I would recommend those. But hopefully this has been helpful to you. This is a little bit more on the heavy philosophical side, but I hope that you found it interesting and helpful, particularly if you're looking for more books to explore. And if so, just let me know. If you have other titles, other things you'd recommend, post them down in the comments, and maybe I'll get a chance to take a look at it. But I hope that you enjoyed this, and thanks for watching, and I will see you for the next title that I review.